Hey everyone, welcome back. Ready for another deep dive. Today we're taking a look at something that's probably already touched your lives, but you might not even realize it.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, artificial intelligence. And no, not the Terminator kind or, robots taking over the world kind of stuff.
Okay.
We're talking about the AI that's already changing how we shop, like right now.
Interesting.
And, maybe more importantly, how it's impacting the people who work in retail.
Right. Yeah, I could see that.
Exactly. So to help us unpack all of this, we're going to be diving into this investigative podcast called AI Unmasked: Retail Workers versus Surveillance Hell.
Wow, that title.
Right. It sounds pretty intense. And from what I've heard, it definitely lives up to the hype. It goes deep into what's happening in stores all over the country.
I'm intrigued already. What kind of stuff are we talking about here? Like, are we talking about AI cashiers or like robot stalkers? I mean, those things are out there, definitely. But this podcast goes way beyond that. It's more about, well, I guess I shouldn't spoil it all. But let's just say it starts with this story about this Target employee named Sarah who got in trouble with the AI for something you wouldn't even believe.
Oh, really? What happened?
So get this. Sarah was working her shift and she scratched her nose.
Scratch your nose.
Yeah, just like a normal, itch. And the AI system flagged her for it.
Wait, seriously, what did they think she was doing? Like picking it or something?
I mean, who knows? But the system interpreted it as, I guess, not being attentive enough or something.
That's wild. Like, how can they even tell that from a camera?
Well, apparently they have all these cameras with facial recognition software that can analyze your every expression.
So not only do they track your every move, but they also want you to, perform happiness.
It seems that way, right? The podcast mentions they threatened to cut her hours unless she smiled more.
Seriously.
Yeah, and I mean, it just makes you think, where do we draw the line? How much monitoring is too much?
I can see the need for security cameras, but this is taking it to a whole other level.
It really is. And the thing is, Sarah's story is not unique at all. Actually, the podcast mentions that in a 2024 report from the Economic Policy Institute, they found that 73%, get this, 73% of retail workers are now being monitored by these AI systems.
Wow. That's more than 2/3 of all retail workers.
Exactly. So this isn't just some fringe thing anymore. It's becoming the norm.
I mean, think about it. That's almost every retail worker you encounter.
It's kind of mind-blowing, right? And it's not just the traditional security cameras we're talking about. We're talking facial recognition, movement tracking, even algorithms that analyze your tone of voice to see if you're stressed or upset.
You're kidding me. So basically it's like Big Brother, but on steroids.
That's one way to put it, yeah. The podcast really dives into how some of these specific systems work. They talk about Amazon's warehouse robot called Sparrow.
I think I've heard of that one.
Yeah, it's the one that's it's been in the news a lot because it can pack boxes really fast, and it's supposed to be super efficient.
So what's the problem?
Well, it turns out that Sparrow isn't just packing boxes, it's also watching the human workers around it, constantly. Yeah, some leaked documents showed that these AI-powered systems are flagging workers for taking micro breaks as short as 12 seconds.
12 seconds. That's barely enough time to catch your breath.
Exactly. It's you can't even turn your head for a second without the AI judging you.
That sounds exhausting.
And kind of dehumanizing, right? You're not even allowed to be a human being for a few seconds.
It's like they think we're robots too.
And you know what? If you think Amazon is bad, wait till you hear about what's happening at Walmart. They've got this system called the Employee Compliance Algorithm that can actually automatically fire workers.
No way. Without any human intervention.
That's what the podcast says. And get this, the algorithm targets any worker whose efficiency score falls below 99.8%.
99.8%. Seriously. Is that even possible?
I mean, nobody's perfect, right? What if you have an off day? Or what if something's going on in your personal life that's affecting your focus?
It doesn't seem to leave much room for being human, does it?
That's one of the big things the podcast is trying to highlight. What happens to compassion and understanding in a system where machines are making these huge, life-altering decisions?
It's a good question. One that I don't think we have a good answer for yet.
Yeah, and to make matters even worse, it seems like some companies are trying to use legal loopholes to avoid any responsibility for what their AI systems do.
Oh, really? Tell me more about that.
So they're using something called Section 230. which was meant to protect internet platforms from being sued for stuff that users post online.
Right, I've heard of that.
But now companies are trying to argue that AI decisions are basically like user-generated content because the algorithms are like learning and making choices on their own.
So they're claiming the AI is a separate person and they can't be held accountable for its actions.
That's the gist of it, yeah.
Oh.
Pretty slippery, huh?
It sounds like a way to just completely dodge responsibility.
That's what it seems like. And it leaves workers in this really vulnerable position. The podcast interviewed this employment lawyer, Jessica Lynn, who said this interpretation of Section 230 is basically leaving workers with no legal recourse if they're treated unfairly by an AI.
Wow. So it's like you're totally at the mercy of the algorithm.
That's what it sounds like.
Yeah.
So what can workers do? Is there any way to fight back against this AI surveillance?
Well, that's what we'll be exploring next. The podcast talks about some pretty creative ways workers are pushing back, but it also reveals just how hard it is to fight a system that's designed to be all-seeing and all-knowing.
I'm all ears. Let's get into it. It's like you said before, it really is kind of Big Brother-ish, isn't it?
Yeah, it's definitely unsettling.
And the podcast doesn't hold back on the specifics either. They get into all the different kinds of data these systems are collecting, and it's kind of creepy. Like,
Right.
it's not just watching you on camera,
It's everything. It
Yeah.
really is.
Yeah.
It's not just, like you said, where you are in the store or how long you take for a break. They're analyzing everything. Keystrokes, mouse movements,
no way.
even your tone of voice and facial expressions.
So, like, they can tell if you're having a bad day.
Well, that's what they claim.
Yeah.
They call it sentiment analysis.
Yeah.
But it's basically trying to read your mind, you know.
That's wild. So it's not enough to just do your job. You got to look happy doing it, too.
That seems to be the message, yeah.
What if you're just not a smiley person? Are you going to get fired?
Well, that's one of the big concerns with all this, right?
Yeah.
Bias and fairness. Like, what if the AI misinterprets something, you know?
Right.
Cultural differences, maybe. Facial expressions mean different things in different cultures.
Exactly. And how do we know it's even accurate? Like, who programmed these things?
It's a good question. A lot of times we don't even know.
The podcast talked about workers not even knowing they were being monitored
Yeah, several people they interviewed had no idea.
until they got in trouble.
Exactly. Suddenly disciplined or even fired, and they had no idea why.
That's messed up. It's scary, honestly. It makes you feel like you're being watched all the time, like someone's looking over your shoulder, even when they're not.
It's a loss of control and a loss of privacy.
And it's not just retail, right?
No,
I feel like this is happening everywhere.
it is. Call centers, warehouses, delivery, even offices.
Wow. So is there anything we can do about it? It feels like we're just letting this happen.
Well, people are fighting back.
Yeah.
The podcast highlighted some really interesting tactics that workers are using to disrupt these systems.
Really? Like what?
Well, some of it is pretty creative, like smiling excessively to confuse the facial recognition,
Like that.
using infrared LEDs to blind the cameras.
Clever. But also kind of sad that we have to resort to that.
It is. But it shows that people aren't just giving up, they're finding ways to push back.
Right.
Some are even using AI to fight AI.
Wait, what? How does that work?
Well, they're using things like ChatGPT to create scripts for disputing AI-generated write-ups.
That's actually pretty smart. Fighting fire with fire.
Exactly. But there are limitations to individual efforts. We need collective action.
Yeah. And legal protections.
Right.
Is there any hope for that?
There is. The podcast talks about how labor unions are starting to push back. They're negotiating for things like algorithmic grievance clauses in their contracts.
Algorithmic grievance. What's that?
It basically gives workers a way to challenge decisions made by the AI. So if you feel like you've been unfairly penalized by the algorithm, you have a way to appeal.
That makes sense. So there's some human oversight involved. It's not just the AI making the final decision.
Right. But even with safeguards, those algorithms are still making big decisions about people's lives.
Yeah, and that's the thing. That's what we need to be talking about. Not just the technology itself, but how it's being used and who it's benefiting.
It's about the bigger picture.
Exactly. And I think that's a good segue into the final part of our deep dive. So we've talked about a lot of the bad stuff, like how AI is being used to monitor workers and even punish them. But is there a way to use this stuff ethically? Like, could AI actually be good for workers?
You know, that's the big question everyone's asking.
Right.
And I think the answer is yes, it definitely can be. but we have to like flip the script, you know?
So instead of focusing on using AI for efficiency and control, you're saying we should be looking at how it can actually make work better for people.
Exactly. Imagine AI that like helps you learn new skills or gives you real-time feedback.
Interesting.
Or even takes over all the boring, repetitive tasks so you can focus on more interesting things.
Yeah, that sounds a lot better than constantly being watched and judged by some algorithm.
Right. So how do we get there?
Yeah, how do we get there? It's like pretty far off from that right now.
Well, the podcast had a few ideas. One of the big ones was worker involvement.
What you mean, like give workers a say in how the AI is used?
Exactly. Right now, it's mostly companies and tech people making all the decisions.
And the workers are just left to deal with the consequences.
Exactly. We need to bring workers to the table, like involve them in the design, the testing, all of it.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like if you're going to make a tool that's supposed to help people, you should probably ask those people what they need.
Right. And the podcast also talked about transparency. Like workers should know how these systems work.
Yeah, no more black boxes. I think that would go a long way in building trust.
Definitely. And, speaking of trust, we also need to address bias. We talked about it before, but...
Yeah, like how do we know the AI isn't going to be biased against certain groups of people?
Exactly. And the data used to train these algorithms, that's a huge part of it.
Garbage in, garbage out, right.
Exactly. And that's why the idea of using AI to audit AI is so interesting.
Wait, what? Using AI to check AI?
Yeah. Like, you have one AI system that's designed to look for bias in other AI systems.
That's kind of cool, actually.
It is. But, we've talked a lot about companies and developers. But what about, like, everyday people? What can they do?
Yeah, I was just thinking that. It feels like this is such a big issue, it's hard to know where to even start.
Well, first off, just be aware,
Right. Knowledge is power.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The more people know about this, the better. And, start talking about it.
Yeah, have those conversations with your friends, your family, your coworkers.
Right. And support the organizations that are fighting for ethical AI, for workers' rights.
We can't just wait for someone else to fix this. We all have a role to play.
Absolutely. I think that's a really important takeaway from all this. The future of work, it's not set in stone,
Right. It's up to us to decide what kind of future we want.
Exactly. We have a choice in how we use this technology, and we need to make sure it's used for good.
Well said. I think that's a great place to wrap things up. This has been a pretty intense deep dive, but I think it's an important one. And for everyone listening, remember, knowledge is the first step. Keep learning, keep questioning, and keep pushing for a future where technology serves humanity, not the other way around.
Thanks for joining us.